my name is Dave Wisnan. I'm one of the conference editors for the Public Land and Resources Law Review. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see such a big crowd this morning, and we're really pleased and fortunate to have so many great experts on these panels. The next panel is titled New Rules in Forest Planning and Cross-Jurisdictional Planning Approaches. It's a very timely panel. As everyone knows, the planning rules are on their way out or being revised. This morning we have as our moderator slash panelist a professor of natural resource policy, Martin Nye. And then next to him we have General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Alan Campbell. And then next to Alan we have the Director for Policy for American Forests, Rebecca Turner. And special thanks to the Energy and Environment section of the Federal Bar Association. They sponsored Rebecca's trip out here for the panel. And finally we have Martha Williams, who is the Deputy Solicitor for the Parks and Wildlife at the Department of Interior. So let's get going. We have until about 11:10 for this panel, and then we'll break for lunch. So we'll bring up Martin to start, I believe.
Can you hear me? Is that good? I just want to thank Dave and Matt and the review again for inviting me to participate. It's something I look forward to every year. I get to cancel my classes for a couple of days, and I really look forward to it. And I think this is going to be a great lineup. I can't wait to talk about planning. My only critique so far is that it's the most boring title of the entire conference in terms of new rules in forest planning and cross-jurisdictional planning approaches. So I'll apologize for that. I had nothing to do with it. My suggested alternative would be Woody Allen's famous quote, "If you want to make God laugh, plan." That might be more appropriate, I think. So we're going to go in the following order. Alan Campbell is going to speak first. I'll bat second, Rebecca third, and Martha last. Cleanup. So let me quickly introduce Alan Campbell. He's an attorney with the USDA Office of General Counsel since 1988. He has worked in the Juneau and Missoula field offices. His primary responsibilities are currently NEPA, NIFMA, ESA, and real property law. Prior to his service with OGC, he worked for a law firm, Preston Gates and Ellis in Portland, Oregon. Before law school, he worked as a hydrologist with the Pacific Northwest Research Forest and Range Experiment Station. Alan has a BS in forestry from Michigan Tech, an MS in forest engineering, hydrology from Oregon State, and a JD from the University of Washington. So please welcome Alan Campbell.
Well, like Chief Thomas, I intend to be intentionally provocative. Unlike Chief Thomas, I still am an employee of the United States, and so I have to issue a disclaimer. The views expressed are entirely my own, not those of the United States Department of Agriculture, United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service, or United States Department of Agriculture Office of the General Counsel. I do want to mention one thing before I start. It is a real pleasure to see Professor Rogers here. 25 years ago, I took Professor Rogers' environmental law class at the University of Washington, and what I remember about the class is I didn't learn much about actual environmental laws. We spent most of our time talking about Robert Axelrod's book, The Evolution of Cooperation, which had just been published at that time. Anybody who's a fan of game theory would know that title. And to this day, I think that class and the discussions there have probably been the most profound influence on my thinking about environmental and social issues in general, and for that, I want to thank Professor Rogers. They asked if I had a PowerPoint, and we always have to have a PowerPoint these days. So, when we talk about the relationship between forests and society in general, I think it's helpful to go back and look that that relationship has been at the very core of the development of the National Forest System, as well as the National Forest in general. For the first 100 years of the United States, we probably tried to get rid of the public domain as fast as we could. Of the 1.4 billion acres that originally made up the public domain, We managed to get rid of about 2/3 of it by the mid-1800s. We gave it away for almost any purpose you can think of. We gave it to homesteaders, we gave it to states, we gave it to railroads. But about the middle of that century, people started to debate whether that was wise and started to debate the concept of the relationship between land uses and society and the sustainability of society. This is George Perkins Marsh, and in 1864 he wrote one of the preeminent works on conservation called Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. Marsh was one of the first people to advocate sustainable land uses that could sustain societies over time. Shortly thereafter, at least shortly in the concept of history, this guy, Franklin Hough, known as the father of American forestry, wrote an article for the American Association for the Advancement of Science called On the Duty of Governments in the Preservation of Forests. Hough had observed the effects of deforestation on Mediterranean countries and what was happening in the lake states at the time. He argued for permanent protection of forests and federal regulation of their use. Hough became the first chief of the Division of Forestry in the Department of Agriculture. Somewhat resembles Chief Thomas, I guess, in some ways. I would also be remiss if I didn't spend just a minute to talk about the issue of forest in the eastern United States. As a result of some of Hough's and Marsh's thinking, forests were reserved in the western United States, but people also observed that the impact of land management on especially downstream, was a significant factor in the east. Particularly a series of floods led people to think that we need to take better care of our watersheds. 100 years ago this year, Congress passed the Weeks Act, which resulted in the Eastern National Forest. This is Congressman Weeks looking at the draft EIS for the acquisition of some of those lands. This is actually Congressman Weeks. The relationship between national forests and the surrounding community has always been one of concern to the Forest Service. Long before NFMA, the Forest Service used the concept of working circles to plan its activities. Basically, a working circle is simply an area where there could be a sustainable flow of resources from a planning standpoint. Now, in these early days, those resources primarily meant timber, but the idea was new in the concept that forestry up until that time had been a series of cut and runs. You built a mill, you cut all the timber, you moved on. An inexhaustible resource, potentially. This idea was that we were going to sustain communities over the long time, looking at all the resources available to those communities, or at the time, primarily timber mills. These were the planning units, or the working circles for the Flathead National Forest, generally coincided with ranger districts. This notion had probably its peak or heyday in the 1930s when or 1940s, when people started to debate proposing multi-ownership units encompassing private as well as public lands as a means for the federal government to influence management practices on private lands. In 1944, Congress actually enacted this concept into law when it passed the Sustained Yield Forest Management Act of 1944, which allowed for joint management of private and federal lands for planning purposes. Only one of those cooperative units was ever established. This one, the Shelton Cooperative Unit on the Olympic Peninsula. The Simpson Lumber Company had about 160,000 acres of its private land. It was rapidly running out of timber, and it decided to throw in its lot with the federal government. Another 100,000 acres of national forest land was included in the Cooperative Sustained Yield Unit and managed as a joint enterprise. This lasted actually up, the Shelton unit was finally disbanded, I think, in 2002, officially. Simpson remains in business today. And that brings us really up to date to sort of the modern era of planning, NFMA in 1976. The NFMA provisions regarding consideration of off-forest resources relate to the coordination between non-federal lands. Essentially, the top one is the language from NFMA. It says that develop, maintain, and as appropriate, revise land and resource management plans for units of the National Forest System, coordinated with the land and resource management planning process of state and local governments and other federal agencies. It doesn't say any more than that, doesn't really explain it. Senator Humphrey, at the time of the passage of NFMA, said that this provision was meaning to consult and give careful consideration to the impact of these plans on local jurisdictions. And in the Supreme Court case, California Coastal Commission versus Granite Rock, the United States took the position that it provides merely an advisory role in federal land management decisions. So in essence, it is a permissive ability to coordinate planning across jurisdictions, but not a requirement to do so. Of course, what's happening on other lands besides the National Forest plays a significant role in terms of the National Forest System lands. This is not a very good map, but it's a portion of a map from the Idaho Panhandle National Forest. These are the large private inholdings. As you can see, what they're doing on their lands is clearly going to affect National Forest lands and how we would plan on those lands. I don't think you can see this one very well. Actually, it's an actual checkerboard ownership. You can see it actually 1 mile square checkerboards of clear cuts from the Priest River area on the Idaho Panhandle. So clearly what's going on these checkerboards was going to influence the National Forest. But at least in that circumstance, it's still being managed for forest purposes. What happens when it leaves sort of coordinated ownership and you get this sort of development? How can you possibly integrate sort of this kind of land use into general planning for the long term? And what about the situation like this, where the National Forest might make up a very small percentage of the lands? This is the Uwharrie National Forest in South Carolina. So I think there have been some successful efforts for joint planning. Fire, I think, has been very successful. We share resources across ownerships. We share common management. We know who's going to respond to fire. Weeds, very similar. Resources are efficiently shared across ownerships, common management objectives. And surprisingly, I think actually endangered species are another successful effort in terms of cross-jurisdictional planning. I think there are problems, though, with broader efforts, not only from a cross-jurisdictional planning standpoint, but from a planning standpoint in general. If you look at why some of these efforts have worked and some haven't, typically that where they've been successful, there's common management objectives. Historically, the objective for fire is to put it out. The objective for weeds is to kill them. And the objective for endangered species, as we heard this morning, is anything else, forget about it, we're going to recover those species, whatever the cost. There are a few variables generally affecting the outcome of these plans, and because these have been single-issue plans, they're relatively simple systems. Put into the concept of complexity theory, we can see that there's a fairly high degree of, somewhere I think I have a high degree of agreement in terms of what to do for these fairly simple systems like fire, and a fairly high degree of certainty as to what to do about it. As we move away from those kinds of situations, though, towards generally planning in general, as we heard this morning, probably less a degree of agreement in terms of what to do with planning, what should we do in terms of management. We have lots of thoughts on that, and much less degree of certainty in terms of the effect. And so then we're in the area of actually complex management systems or complex environment. And what we know about complex systems is that they don't lend themselves very well to planning or even to predicting the future. In terms of the complexity theory, these would be called nonlinear dynamic systems with both positive and negative feedback loops. What you do one day may have an effect. If you do it the next day, because you're at a different starting point, it may be completely different. Just to give an example, if you plant trees on one day, in 200 years you may have an old-growth forest. You plant them the next year, and then it's a drought, you may end up with a brush field for 60 years. So your end point may diverge wildly just depending on where the starting point is, even though you have the same management system. And so what we know about planning in these circumstances is that it doesn't work very well. In fact, it may be counterproductive in terms of achieving our goals. Basically, the future is unknowable in any systems of any complexity. Long-term planning becomes an irrelevance because you can't predict the future. Just a few examples. You could look at the effort we put into the initial planning for the National Forest in the 1970s. Largely became irrelevant just a couple years after those plans became final. Another example, anybody might remember in the early 90s, we were concerned about the amount of harvest of Pacific yew in the Northwest. It had been discovered that Pacific yew has a Taxol, which is a cancer-fighting chemical. In 1992, there was about 27,000 kilograms of Pacific yew bark harvested. In fact, Congress even passed the Pacific Yew Act in order to ensure proper management of the Pacific yew. 2 years later, that harvest dropped to virtually zero, except for a few people collecting boughs for Christmas purposes, because a synthetic source of Pacific yew had been developed. We can't know the future, particularly in systems of any complexity. And so planning becomes very difficult in that situation. There are disparate management goals between private lands, school trust lands, national parks, national forests, very complex systems, cumbersome and overlapping planning processes. And so the idea that we can plan for 15 or 10 or 15 years in the future in those sorts of systems, I think, is really unfounded. Look at our traditional planning process, which is basically over here on the left. We believe that plans are reductionist, that the whole becomes equal to the sum of the parts. System behavior is knowable, predictable, and controllable. That's been the whole concept of particularly linear planning that's underlied forest plans. Relationships are directional. You give us your comments, we'll tell you what the plan is and respond to them. Decisions are based on facts and data. Forest Service is very good at collecting facts and data, less good at navigating the wants and needs of society in general. Efficiency and reliability are the measures of value. Anybody who was around during the first planning process remembers PNV. Present net value became the source of determining whether one proposal was better than another proposal. And so what we find that in complex systems, this doesn't work. But unfortunately, this is the system we're kind of stuck with. In complex systems, we really need to be more on this side of things, where the decision makers, leaders are facilitators and supporters, decisions are based on tensions and patterns, systems are treated as unique, and so on. Now, I do need to finally get to the proposed planning regs. And I think the proposed planning regs would really like to be more on this side. The problem is, of course, that they still have to be consistent with the laws that are in place, which force us over on this side. And so we get things like, well, we'll use collaborative processes where appropriate, consistent with our needs to actually make the decision. In other words, we'll listen to what you have to say, but ultimately we're still going to make the decision. We're not really going to collaborate. We'll have more public involvement. We'll really double down on public involvement so that we know better what the people want. My experience with planning has never been that we've lacked public involvement. I think what the public wants is more of a say in what the actual decision is, and so on. So, while I think the new planning regs are very helpful in some respects, ultimately I think they amount to rearranging the deck chairs, and I think what we really need is perhaps to be on a different boat. So with that, I will end and turn it back over to Martin. Thank you.
I supposed to do with that conclusion? Okay. So what I'd like to do, 15 minutes or so if I can, is just make some general comments about cross-jurisdictional planning, and maybe say a few words about the proposed planning rule, put it into some context. I've really appreciated the opportunity to think again about cross-jurisdictional planning and what that means these days. And I was offered to do so to give this talk last spring. At the same time, I had a group of academics ask me a really interesting question to write about. Whatever happened to ecosystem management and federal lands planning? And, you know, ecosystem management meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But one of the commonalities was this agreement that we need to start planning and thinking at a larger landscape level, at larger spatial scales. So to be honest, I didn't know what to make of either offer. My cynical side questioned the relevance of talking about ecosystem management. The language is not used anymore. Roughly 2 decades after the term became popularized, and here we are talking about the same problems, the same challenges. So instead of talking about ecosystem management, the Forest Service is now talking about a, quote, all lands approach to planning. So then I questioned whether or not I should give a sort of provocative talk, maybe talk about ecosystem management as a sort of obituary, right, an obituary for ecosystem management. Because now the language du jour is adaptation, landscape scale restoration, ecosystem services, resiliency. All these terms like ecosystem management are subject to wildly different interpretations. And some language, like sustainability, becomes so politically appropriated that it loses its original meaning. But I came to conclude that that cynical narrative, it's too cynical of narrative to use. My take is that the story is much messier, but one with some hope. So here's my thesis in a nutshell, that the central components of cross-jurisdictional planning or ecosystem management have undoubtedly made their way onto the federal lands. This includes adaptive management, collaboration, and restoration. All were commonly associated with ecosystem management, and now all figure more prominently in federal land politics and planning. So all the talk about ecosystem management was not in vain. The problem, however, is that the same barriers to practicing a more ecosystem-based or cross-jurisdictional approach to planning are still in place. The legal and institutional challenges identified years ago in hindering ecosystem management now frustrate its progeny, and efforts in adaptive management, collaboration, landscape scale restoration, and other related initiatives. So first of all, just for some background, it's easy, and as Alan talked about, it's easy to see why there is a need to think about and plan at larger, across administrative boundaries. Consider, for example, that national forests provide 18% of the nation's water and over 50% of the West's water. More than 60 million Americans are dependent upon a U.S. Forest Service managed water supply. And while this water originates on the national forest, we all know that to reach our faucets, this water crosses a confusing jumble of different land ownerships. The blue rash of state trust lands, in-holdings, checkerboards from hell, etc. And the land fragmentation problem has only become more acute since the emergence of ecosystem management. So let me give you some quick numbers, if I may. Although 41% of the Rocky Mountain West consists of public lands, less than 25% is more than 1.2 miles removed from private land. And these private lands are quickly becoming developed. From 1982 to 1997, 3.2 million acres of ranch land were converted to developed land. And some studies estimate that another 25 million acres of strategic ranch lands are at risk of residential development by 2020. Or take forest lands. Between 1982 and 1997, more than 10 million acres were converted to something else, with another 26 million acres projected to be developed by 2030. This development, moreover, is taking place at the problematic interface of wild and urban lands. Estimates show that from 1990 to 2000, 60% of new housing units were built in the wildland-urban interface. So the numbers kind of numb people, I think. So a better way of getting this point across is to think about this often told story of grizzly bears in Yellowstone. And I think it's a story that's been told often for a reason. Suffice it to say that the grizzly bear has habitat needs that go beyond Yellowstone National Park. Thus, the political emergence of this greater Yellowstone ecosystem, roughly 20 million acres big. Right? And within that ecosystem are 2,500 miles of administrative boundaries, managed by 25 different federal, state, and local agencies. Now enter the grizzly bear. Right? And the grizzly bear, like other transboundary resources, weeds, water, wildlife, and assortment of other issues, require a boundary-spanning approach. We know this. I think we've known this since Leopold. We've certainly known it since we've read the ecosystem management literature. But the question of how to plan at appropriate spatial scales is much tougher than it sounds. Again, the case of grizzly bears provides a good example of this. To recover grizzly bears, the federal government is writing ESA-mandated conservation strategy and recovery plan, 3 state bear management plans, the amending of 6 national forest plans, and then you consider how to do cumulative effects analysis for the habitat needs of the grizzly bear, and then you consider how to coordinate all of these plans, how to enforce these plans, adapt them, assuming that is they survive the judiciary, which they didn't. So despite this reality, most first-generation plans written by federal land agencies and the Forest Service were generally inward-looking affairs, focused for the most part on single units of administration. But as Chief Thomas reminded us, this insularity was shaken by the spotted owl crisis in the Pacific Northwest. The ESA and its enforcement by the courts best explains the emergence of ecosystem management and some of the success in cross-jurisdictional planning. As some of you might recall, Judge Dwyer invoked the Endangered Species Act and NIFMA's viability clause as a way to endorse the boundary-spanning Northwest Forest Plan. Like the habitat needs of the grizzly bear, the spotted owl required agency to consider the big picture and plan accordingly. And I think this history is very important to consider in terms of the proposed planning rule and what the agency ends up doing about wildlife viability. That sharp legal hook, though it might be a headache to the Forest Service, has helped drive more ecosystem-based approaches to forest planning and management. So where does this leave us? And we might spend some time talking about all the highly publicized failures of ecosystem management and cross-jurisdictional planning. All the biggies that have crashed and burned over the years, like the Interior Columbia a few years ago. We could also make fun of federal land agencies, including the Forest Service, for being so afraid of saying such a scary, offensive, politically incorrect word, buffers. Not funny, I guess. Just for the policy nerds out there, I suppose. But I don't think those large-scale planning initiatives, the highly publicized landscape initiatives, tell the whole story. Instead, consider some counterexamples. Consider, for instance, some of the good news that has emerged around Glacier National Park and the crown of the continent. Perhaps a form of de facto-based ecosystem management. Or consider the well-oiled machine of the Blackfoot Challenge and all that it has accomplished. It has a simple mission to coordinate efforts that conserve and enhance the natural resources and rural way of life throughout the watershed. And I think the Blackfoot Challenge demonstrates the type of conservation imagined years before in the name of ecosystem management. Or consider the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program and its widespread support. Some of the programs chosen for that program are at the cutting edge of conservation. Or consider various bottom-up, place-based initiatives that are trying to figure out a way how to plan and manage the national forest at larger landscape levels. Or consider some smaller victories, such as the Forest Service designation of a wildlife corridor for pronghorn on the Bridger Teton a few years ago at the southern end of Greater Yellowstone. These examples prove little in isolation, but research shows that they are part of a pattern showing that some haphazard progress to cross-jurisdictional planning has taken place. They are not enough, but I think it's too soon to write an obituary. So some progress has been made. But my take is that some of the major barriers impeding ecosystem management now frustrate its descendants, including adaptive management, collaboration, and landscape scale restoration. While the terminology differs, the challenges do not. And while progress has been made on various fronts, the following discussion shows how federal land agencies continue muddling through some challenges presented to them decades ago under the rubric of ecosystem management. So what are these challenges and impediments? Well, first of all, I'm uncomfortable even calling them challenges because some of these impediments are actually important environmental laws that provide a backstop and environmental safeguards. Nevertheless, I think we should spend some time talking about NEPA in this context. And it seems impossible to have a grown-up conversation about NEPA these days. And if I was forced to choose sides, I'm going with the NEPA nuts. But I also recognize that NEPA can potentially challenge some forms of adaptive planning by agencies. As Alan mentioned, there are some philosophical differences between NEPA in theory, and that sort of linear, predictive-based approach to planning, and more adaptive management approaches to planning, something we might talk about during the discussion. But NEPA can also be challenging in terms of large-scale forest restoration. And I'm not thinking about the sort of bogus applications of forest restoration that some of us are familiar with, but rather some projects that have widespread support and buy-in. Professor Wilkinson last night talked about the Forest Restoration Initiative in Arizona, and it's a good example of this. Here we have a group with widespread support wanting to treat roughly 2.5 million acres of ponderosa pine on 4 forests in Arizona. And they are struggling with some really difficult NEPA challenges. How to do it? How to plan at that large of scale? Should we be doing one big programmatic EIS? How to do effective tiering? How to do important meaningful cumulative effects assessment in such a big landscape? How to do NEPA and strategically time it with the awarding of stewardship contracts? These are difficult questions. Another familiar challenge is presented by appropriations and agency budgets. And this is a shocking revelation, I know. But again, consider some efforts underway in large-scale forest restoration throughout the West. They are continually running into this familiar obstacle. There's a lot of excitement about stewardship contracting, for example, but it is a tool with some serious limitations and drawbacks. Another recognizable challenge to restoration is the programmatically structured nature of the U.S. Forest Service budget. Generally speaking, money for programs on the national forests are based on a limited set of resource-specific line items that get stovepiped from national headquarters to the individual national forests. The problem is that this approach does not align well with the integrated or ecosystem-based nature of forest management. So I'll conclude by suggesting that we view the proposed planning rule in the context I've just outlined. I think it shows how the agency continues to struggle with some familiar obstacles. Some of these are big foundational sorts of challenges, such as how to strike an appropriate balance between the need to plan adaptively and flexibly and the need for political accountability, or how to most effectively do all lands planning in the context of NEPA and constrained budgets. We also see a familiar pattern where the agency wants to do it all, but with a maximum amount of administrative discretion. And I think that is really the dominant theme in the proposed rule, is the amount of discretion that is afforded to forest supervisors in choosing what plan components get emphasized on the ground. The proposed rule is very heavy on things that must be considered by the agency and relatively light on things that shall be done. The response to the rule has also been familiar. Every interest group wants to find in the regulations some legal hook or weapon that they can use against the agency or against themselves in future battles. Most groups also complain about various planning pathologies, especially how long it takes the agency to write a plan and how expensive they are. But of course, that does not stop these same groups from then asking the agency to consider something of their particular interest in more detail in the future. And then there is a predictable fight over NIFMA's diversity mandate and how that should be applied on the ground. My point is that change has taken place on the national forests, but there are some familiar obstacles and impediments as well. Thank you. Me again. Okay. Next introduction. Batting third is Rebecca Turner. Rebecca Turner joined American Forest as the Director of Public Policy in September of 2010. Her work is focused on community-based forestry and bringing the underrepresented voices of local and regional partners to the national policy arena. Prior to joining American Forest, Rebecca worked as a mediator of environmental law and policy conflicts with the Keystone Center, a nonprofit dispute resolution and public policy organization. She holds a Juris Doctorate in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School, a Master of Environmental Management from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Conservation from the University of New Hampshire. Rebecca is admitted to practice law in Massachusetts and Colorado and is a member of the American Bar Association.
Thank you, Professor Nye. First, too, I would like to thank the American Bar Association section on Energy, Environment, and Resources for sponsoring my appearance here today. Okay, now that that obligation is out of the way. As mentioned, I am the Director of Public Policy for American Forests, headquartered in Washington, D.C. American Forest is the oldest conservation organization in the country, founded in 1875 by citizens concerned with the state of the forest in the United States. Our mission today remains true for over 135 years, to protect and restore forests. We were instrumental in advocating for the creation of the Forest Service and the National Forest System. So our interest in how these 193 million acres of forests and grasslands are managed goes back to its beginnings. As an attorney in a nonprofit and previously a mediator for environmental disputes, I thought it would be best if I provide an overview of the public participation process the Forest Service conducted for the 2011 Planning Rule, how it differed from previous versions, and how within the rule itself, collaboration with local communities plays a larger role than before. I will also be examining the proposed objection process laid out in the rule and the unnecessary restrictions placed on the public as what appears to be an attempt to decrease the suits brought against the Forest Service regarding the planning rule. My comments here today are informed by the American Forest's formal public comments and by those submitted by other conservation organizations to ensure I provide a comprehensive view of the major points of admiration and concern we have in the proposed rule as it relates to public participation. As we heard last night, the NFMA required the first set of national planning regulations to convene a committee of scientists who were neither officers nor employees of the Forest Service to provide scientific and technical advice on proposed Forest Service planning guidelines and procedures. The NFMA gives the Secretary the authority to reconvene the Committee of Scientists for revisions to the planning rule. The first Committee of Scientists conducted 18 public meetings throughout the country from May 1977 to January 1979. A 13-member Committee of the Scientists was again convened for the process that resulted in the 2000 rule. The Committee of Scientists provided a report and building on many of the recommendations, the draft planning rule was published in the October of 1999. Following publication, a series of public meetings were held, and more than 10,000 written and oral comments on the draft rule were received and analyzed. For this round, under the guidance of the Obama administration's Open Government Initiative, and perhaps in response to the decade-long suits from the Citizens for Better Forestry, the Forest Service did things differently. After announcing the notice of intent to draft a new planning rule, the Forest Service conducted, from March to May 2010, 3 national roundtables, approximately 40 regional roundtables, a tribal roundtable conference call, and 16 tribal consultation meetings, and a Forest Service staff conference call. Nearly 3,000 members of the public attended the regional roundtables. The Forest Service received over 26,000 comments to the notice of intent, and over 300 comments were posted on the Planning Rule blog. There was a question about how the internet plays a role in the new Forest Service. Blogging is one of them. The Forest Service chose not to convene a committee of scientists for this process, however, instead held a science forum as part of their outreach. After releasing the draft planning rule, the Forest Service again held public meetings, 1 national forum and 9 regional forums in March and April of 2011. These forums were not designed to receive public comment, since according to the Administrative Procedure Act, public input on a proposed rule must be documented in a written record available to any member of the public to inspect. Instead, these forums made agency officials available to the public for questions about the proposed rule and the intent behind the provisions in the proposal. The purpose was to help inform the development of formal written comments by members of the public. Currently, about 2,500 submitted written comments to the rule are available online, and the Forest Service claims they have received approximately 300,000 comments over the entire process. As a mediator in my previous life, I truly believe that involving stakeholders in the planning process leads to better outcomes with fewer contentious points in the plan, as those identified during the process can be addressed. The Forest Service should be commended for responding to public comments solicited within the Notice of Intent and regional roundtables, especially in answering calls for increased emphasis on collaboration and an all-lands approach for planning and management. American Forest applauds the Forest Service for making collaboration a priority in the proposed planning rule and requiring responsible officials to engage state and local governments, tribes, private landowners, and the public at large, especially youth, low-income, and minority populations. However, the proposed rule does not go far enough and is insufficient in establishing processes and procedures to promote collaborative decision-making. The Forest Service does not provide sufficient direction in the text of the proposed rule to improve collaborative decision-making on the National Forest System lands. The proposed rule should strengthen the role of collaborative groups in the planning process, capitalizing on existing local and regional collaborative groups, and conduct outreach strategies in those units where there is an absence of such organizations. Alternative E of the draft EIS provides significant guidance by clarifying the minimum requirements necessary to guarantee public participation in the plan development, making certain that public participation is recognized as an important piece of plan improvement and not dismissed as an optional procedural element. As I outlined, the Forest Service should be commended for their public outreach and participation efforts in the creation of the rule. And the inclusion of the role of collaboration efforts with local communities directly impacted by the management of the forest is admirable. However, in subpart B of the rule, covering the objection process for the plans, the Forest Service proposes to hinder the public's participation and is counter to the ideals it espoused during the notice of intent and draft commenting period of inclusion in public outreach. There are three aspects of the objection process that need to be changed in order to ensure adequate public access and participation. First, the time allowed for filing an objection must be changed from 30 days to 90 days. Second, the final rule must allow objections from individuals and organizations even if they did not submit formal comments. And thirdly, the final rule must remove restrictions on objection content and allow objections to cover topics not included in formal comments. First, the time allowed for filing an objection must be extended. As it stands now, the proposed rule states that written objections, including any attachments, must be filed within 30 days following the publication date of the public notice for a plan, plan amendment, or plan revision before approval. This 30 days is a departure from the past objection procedures and puts a serious and unfair burden on the public to be able to complete and file an objection within the time frame. The period should be extended to 90 days, the time frame the Forest Service has to respond to objections. This section also forbids extensions for filing objections, something else the Forest Service has reserved for itself for their responses. This time limit and extension restriction is inconsistent with the spirit of public participation and should be removed. Second, the proposed rule limits the right to object to only individuals and organizations who have submitted substantive formal comments related to a plan during the objection process. During the opportunity for public comment, This puts an unreasonable burden on the public to preserve their right to object. It does not take into consideration that some objectors are unsophisticated and unrepresented, in which this is particularly burdensome. This section also restricts persons from joining an objection if they did not submit formal comments. Currently, the proposed rule states that when an objection lists multiple individuals or organizations, each party must meet the requirements preserving their right to object. Thirdly, the rule must not restrict the content of the objections to only that which is included in previous formal comments. This restriction, even with the caveat of unless the objection concerns an issue that arose after the opportunities for formal comments, places an undue burden on the public to comment extensively on every plan and project in order to reserve their right to object to an issue. It is also unclear as to what the standard will be in determining if an issue arose after the commenting period. If this standard is applied too strictly, it could extinguish the right of the public to object simply because of the failure to spot an issue early in the process or to state an issue clearly enough in a commenting letter. This requirement is unfair and should be reversed. And finally, the final rule must require that all documents are available to the public before the objection period can start to run. The proposed rule states that the responsible official can make available a public notice to those who have requested the environmental documents and are eligible to file an objection. This notice is not sufficient. Documents should be available for the full public, and notice of their availability should be published in the Federal Register. Considering over a decade of defending previous rules, it is understandable that the Forest Service hopes to enact a planning rule that will not be tested by the courts. To some, it may seem that these suits have taken resources away from managing the forest in order to defend a plan to manage the forests. However, they were not for frivolous suits, and the previous rules had serious deficiencies that needed to be resolved. As a mediator, I truly believe that stakeholder input at the beginning of the process, such as the Forest Service has conducted for this planning rule, will reduce conflicts in the end. But it is not a substitute for the objection process and does not allow for limiting the right to object. Yes, more issues can be resolved up front, but the opportunity to object is a public right, and restrictions on the time allowed to file objections, on the content of those objections, and restrictions on who can file objections will not stop suits from happening. The Forest Service cannot remove a vital step of our governing process, the right of citizens to question their government, just because it offered more opportunities for input in the drafting stages. Thank you.
All right, next is Martha Williams, who one, has horrible handwriting, and two, was late in getting me her biography. She professes to have spent many a sleepless night at the Public Land Law Review during her stint at the U of M. After law school, she worked for all three branches of Montana government, first clerking for Justice Nelson, as an environmental policy analyst for the Environmental Quality Council, and then as legal counsel for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. At Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Martha focused on Endangered Species Act, MEPA, and real estate issues. She has recently been appointed as the Deputy Solicitor of Parks and Wildlife at the Department of the Interior.
Okay, Martin. I'll admit to having terrible handwriting. That must be a reason why I'm a lawyer. And along those lines, I will admit to being late in getting you my biography. But Dave, didn't I? I do believe I sent it in somewhere. But I have to take a deep breath. I'm so delighted to be here because I did spend many a sleepless night working on the journal for the Public Land Law Review, and it's a treat to be here up on this end of the room in addition to listening all the time. So it's a treat to be here for Public Land Law Review, but also because I have recently moved to DC to accept this appointment, and it was a wonderful excuse to come back west, come back to Montana. And as I was flying across the country, so excited to come back here, I felt like my thought process began to clear. And as I landed in Salt Lake City and I looked around and breathed in the air, I thought, oh, I can think about these things better. So I originally planned to put together this PowerPoint presentation. And as I was flying west, I thought, oh, no way, this is just too cookie cutter. This is just the problem that we're dealing with. Really, I need to think about this issue in a different way, and maybe think about it in the way the issue comes up. It's going to be messy. It may be late. It may be, organic and evolve, but it's something we need to do. It's something I need to be thinking about. We all do. Is how do we move forward? How do we take this age-old problem of cross-jurisdictional planning, and how do we learn from what we've done and perhaps do a better job of it in the future? When I talked to the other solicitors in DC for the Department of Interior, I talked to regional solicitors, I talked to the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, regional staff, all about this issue and said, okay, you guys, tell me what you do. What should I address? They all looked at me and said, why don't you go to this conference and come back and tell us what to do? That this is such a prescient issue. We have task forces on these issues. We are constantly trying to figure out how to do this better. If you can come back with an answer, we're all ears. So I'm good for the Public Land Law Review Conference for giving us a chance to work through these issues in a meaningful way. So cross-jurisdictional planning issues, I would like to say it's a new paradigm. It's not. It's been around. I think we're finally learning that we really need to do this. We can't just give it lip service anymore. And if you think about water issues, endangered species, climate issues, they require cross-jurisdictional planning. You can no longer think about them along regional, you can't think of them along political lines, certainly, whether it's a Forest Service, a forest, or BLM, or state, that really these issues require broader thinking. So what does cross-jurisdictional approach to planning really mean? What are we talking about? And I think first we're talking about various parties, federal agencies, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish, NIMS, NOAA, state agencies, tribal governments, local governments, and then, of course, interested parties, stakeholders. So you've got all these different parties, and the agencies, federal, state, tribal governments, local governments, are all operating also under different legal requirements. So you have, and actually, this is not for the acronymically challenged person. When I first took the job in DC, I talked to a friend who's an ad exec, and he said, Martha, the first thing you need to remember is that when people start throwing acronyms around, ask them what they mean. Often we're so used to using them, we forget the specifics of it. Is NEPA, I mean, we all know it so well. Is it Environmental Planning Act? Is it policy? What is it? And I think sometimes we forget that. So as I started going through this presentation, I thought, oh my goodness, there are so many acronyms. And I brought with me, this is part of working in DC, you wear a little badge. You can't go anywhere without your badge. And I looked down on mine the first day, and it says SOL. And I thought, all right, I'm going to start asking about acronyms and hope that indeed that is not indicative of where I'm going. But so we have these various parties, and then we have the different laws. So Alan covered the Forest Service and Forest Service laws. There's also forest planning on the BLM, and so that's FLPMA, not NIFMA. We've got BMPs, we've got biological opinions, BAs, NFMA, NEPA, NFP, all these acronyms. But it's important because there really are different laws that have different nuances. I mean, NFMA is different from FLPMA, so Forest Service is necessarily going to have a different direction than the BLM. These issues have come up for me mostly with Western Oregon, and so that's an example that I will work through. And in Western Oregon, the BLM is under the directive not only of the FLPMA, but also the ONC Act that applies to Oregon specifically. And so that has some different mandates that has really complicated planning in Western Oregon. So just the various laws really impact the issues and can make it more complicated. Yes, we can go through those, but so we have the substantive laws, we have procedural laws, we have the regulations, we have planning, and then we have MOUs guiding federal agencies working together. And I think we can talk about all those things as being concrete, but not to forget, with cross-jurisdictional planning, we also have these collaborative projects building up, like the Blackfoot Challenge. I think we have these more organic processes building up where communities are realizing that they can work in different ways, that it doesn't all have to be directed by the planning process itself. I appreciate what Martin said earlier. As I was rethinking the presentation, I thought, what are we talking about here? And what I can add differently than Alan and Rebecca and Martin is the additional layer of the Endangered Species Act, which Martin covered. And I was trying to think through, okay, do we have a framework of where planning, a cross-jurisdictional planning process has worked? Do we have one that hasn't been challenged? And so I was trying to think through, and I thought the Gifford-Pinchot, there's a case regarding planning in Western Oregon, and it's Gifford-Pinchot Task Force versus U.S. Forest Service. And that challenged the Western Forest, well, it challenged 6 biological opinions issued under biological opinions and incidental take statements that were part of the Western, let's see, let me get my acronym straight. The Western Forest Plan, is that right? The West Forest Plan. Northwest Forest Plan, see, NFP. So under the NFP. And what the court said there, and I think it gave hope to this messy process, is that it allowed plans that front load the process, address species recovery. If the plan does that on the front end, then there's more room, more flexibility, more credit given to what the agencies have done regarding Section 7 consultation with endangered species. So it was the first case, I think, that really allowed some flexibility but recognized that species recovery is important, but if the planning process addresses it, the consultation process can be smoother after that. So what does the Endangered Species Act require, and what is Section 7? And another anecdote on Section 7 is, before going to DC to work for the Department of Interior, I did work for the state of Montana and really thought the Endangered Species Act was species listing, delisting, and recovery. I didn't get to work on the rest of the act. I mean, that's all we focused on. Well, there's a whole lot more to the Endangered Species Act, obviously, for a lot of you, and things that we should pay attention to. So one provision of the act, I think, that doesn't always get noticed is Section 7A1, that absolutely requires and directs all federal agencies to work to conserve threatened and endangered species. That's a proactive requirement, and it's not just the details. It's saying, let's work to do this. And I think that the Blackfoot Challenge, that's an example of it, and that the Department of Interior is starting to pay more attention to 7A1 and try to be proactive. And so using 7A1 to require collaboration in the planning process. And because of 7A1, the Department of Interior, Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries have signed various MOUs directing collaboration, and I think in part recognizing some mistakes they've made in the past. Moving forward, recognizing that planning does trigger the need for biological opinions, that there are certain requirements that we've moved beyond. So Section 7A2 requires agencies taking an action that may affect a threatened and endangered species to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. If it appears that the action may affect a threatened or endangered species, the agency first prepares a biological assessment. If that biological assessment demonstrates that action is likely to adversely affect a threatened or endangered species, you go through formal consultation and go through the biological opinion process. In that process, you determine whether the activity will jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species. So it sounds in some degrees like NEPA, but NEPA's procedural, the Endangered Species Act, is absolutely substantive. But the issue with planning and doing these site-specific requirements like, well, going through the NEPA process or going through Section 7 consultation is this inherent tension of needing the broad general issues, the broad scope, the 50,000 feet in the air view, and squaring that with being able to do specific impact analyses and understanding what's going to happen to specific species, how can we issue an incidental take statement here. So it's that constant tension of knowing you need the specifics, but how do you do that when you also are doing this general planning? So the Gifford Pinchot case that I mentioned, I think moves that forward and in part recognizes that, yes, there's this requirement, absolute requirement, that you go through the Section 7 consultation. But is there room for some tiered analysis? And I think the circuit courts aren't clear on that. There's no definitive answer on that. But what we're recognizing is that if there's a tiered analysis, that if you front load the planning process and really addressed lands, waters, species conservation, if you address those issues, then the biological opinions, the incidental take statements can address the specific impacts. And if you build in the planning process or the 50,000 feet view, some sideboards, some recognition of what can or can't happen. Those scary for us policy wonks who laughed at Martin's joke about buffers. I can't even say it very loudly, buffers. If you address some issues like that and have some sideboards, then perhaps you can ease the tension between the broader view, the 50,000 feet view, and then the specific impacts that you can't know what the actions will be exactly, you can't know what the impacts will be exactly, but you can know perhaps how to guide what will happen and how it will impact a species in the future. So I think the MOAs, the federal agencies entering MOAs, the task forces that are a result of those, people are thinking about it. It takes years to change something. I'm realizing for the federal government things are very slow, but I think people are really working on the issue. And to the Forest Service credit, the new rules, I think, really do require and address at least the recovery of species on the front end, and take the examples of the Gifford Pinchot case and put them to work to say, look, here's something that did work, made it through judicial challenge, and we're going to take some of those examples and put them into the new rule. So that is commendable. Circling back on what Martin said when he was thinking through the issue of adaptive management, collaboration, and landscape scale restoration, I think that's exactly what the federal agencies are trying to think through. And I think that's exactly the message that we need to take forward. And it may be messy, but there is hope for it, certainly. So I think I'll end there and go with questions.
Yeah, can we just open it up, audience questions, comments?
Thank you. The title is part of the title is cross-jurisdictional planning. Part of that cross-jurisdiction covers other federal, state, and local agencies, cities, counties, conservation districts, state units of government, and they can be cooperating agencies along with the lead agency in planning efforts. What's your perspective on the importance of other state and local jurisdictions in the planning process?
You're not making eye contact with me, right? You're asking.
Maybe I'll jump into that. I think it's very important to have as early as possible to have those entities involved in the process, ideally in a collaborative manner so that we're working towards a joint solution to whatever the issues and problems are, and they're helping to build that solution as we go along rather than back-end commenting in a reactionary mode. So I think it's critical.
I would agree with that. And the BLM regulations require at least that collaboration on the state level.
In DC, we're seeing many of the silos being broken down across the federal government. And you have things like the America's Great Outdoors Act where BLM, well, DOI, USDA are trying to figure out how to work together. So I think even when in the federal government, you've got groups, different agencies actually talking to each other now.
Any other questions?
My question is about adaptive management. It came up a couple times, I think, throughout a lot of your presentations. And I'm specifically concerned about the new forest planning rules. So Alan, this may be a little bit directed at you, but I'm definitely interested in anybody's input. It seems like adaptive management, by its nature, requires a lot of flexibility to make changes in the future, hence the NEPA issues that were mentioned, I think, by Martin. But at the same time, it doesn't seem, to me anyway, that discretion or ultimate discretion to do whatever in terms of adaptive management is really a solution to providing that flexibility. Do you guys have any input or thoughts on where we might be able to provide flexibility with direction as opposed to flexibility with discretion?
Well, I think you raise a really good point. I think that the concept of adaptive management, fitting it into the framework that we've got for planning, which is front-end loaded on analysis and predictions about what's going to occur, doesn't lend itself very well to having flexibility. Martin mentioned briefly about NEPA, and I sometimes wonder if we wouldn't be better off back-ending our analysis and focusing on monitoring and adaptation rather than trying to predict what the future might hold in terms of the effect of some project out multi-years. I think what, in terms of adaptive management, I think what we're going to have to do is incorporate enough safeguards into that process so that there isn't unfettered discretion to do whatever you want, but that it feeds back into hopefully a collaborative process to consider those issues and make adjustments as you go along. But it's not a very good fit with the formal normative planning process that we have currently. It is a bit of a round peg in a square hole or a bit of a tough fit to make those work. And that's been some of the struggles we've had as an agency in terms of adaptive management.
Yeah, I think NEPA and adaptive management there are tensions between the two, but they can be reconciled. And I think the Forest Service got this discussion off on the wrong foot in 2005 and 2008, because the way in which the agency tried to frame the issue back then was to say that, there's this rampant uncertainty out there. We need more flexibility in order to do a more adaptive sort of planning. But in order to do that sort of adaptive management and planning, the agency basically said that we have to unshackle ourselves from all NEPA. And they're going to relieve themselves of some of the sharpest legal hooks that have historically held that agency accountable. So I think it got an important discussion off on a bad foot. And I think the proposed regulations are a more serious attempt to try to figure out how to do adaptive management in the context of NEPA. I don't think we're there yet. As a member of the science panel last year for the planning regulations, I suggested that they provide a more structured adaptive planning process, where you use trigger mechanisms, for example, as a way to bridge the theory and science of adaptive management with the need for political accountability and some certainty along the way. and they didn't go in that direction, unfortunately. But, and I think we'll continue to muddle through with this issue.
And I think there's evidence that the courts will support that to some degree, where you have the front-ended analysis, but you have monitoring and/or, if Martin's talking about triggers, if you include those, I think that allows for some flexibility as long as there's some assurance that those issues will be addressed.
This is really directed toward Rebecca primarily, but others certainly weigh in. I'm a longtime public participation practitioner myself, and I applaud the front end opening up of the process, and I have some serious concerns about shutting down this back end the way this planning looks like right now. It seems like the Forest Service is trying to set a precedent here of shutting down the back end. I haven't seen that happen in other agencies. Is this something that you're seeing as a potential trend? And is it also a reaction within the Forest Service? There still seems to be a lot of cultural resistance to public participation and to allowing the public to weigh in and losing that expertise and sense of it's our decision to make.
I think that there is kind of a layered thing going on in the Forest Service where you have the top end with Chief Tidwell and Mary Wagner wanting to include collaboration. Mary Wagner comes from the Pacific Northwest area that has quite a long history in collaborative groups working together. Then you have the different layers of and those are the political appointments, and you have the career Forest Service, and I realize I am overgeneralizing here, that have the kind of the old school thinking of the Forest Service. I haven't seen this through in other agencies that we work with. To their credit, at the National Forum this year, the reason why they had a shorter amount for, or what they say they had the reason, the shorter amount for the public to comment and the longer amount for them to respond in their objections is that they think that there'll be fewer conflicts because of all of this front-end approach, and that the longer period of time is for them to work with the objector to come to an agreement. That's the intent from higher up. What we know is that intent doesn't always come through in written rule, and that the opportunities for it's not so much abuse, but for a strict reading of the rule would require, they can put something out in August or over the holidays and expect people to have 30 days because it's 30 calendar days, not 30 work days. So I agree with your concern, and it came up in a number of the different comments that a number of conservation groups that I read through and worked on, and other groups. So hopefully they'll hear that just because you have an open front end doesn't mean you can close off the back end.
Any other questions? All right, and I guess we'll break for lunch. The next panel is on Native American use rights on forest lands, and it begins at 12:30. We'll have Professors Bill Rogers and Charles Wilkinson, as well as John Carter from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. And that should be a great panel, so make back at 12:30 for the panel. Thanks a lot.
Okay.